Hello folks, this is Sullla once again. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a bit of a video podcast or video editorial taking a look at Diablo 3. Essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting up a video version of an article that's up on my website, and I will go ahead and link that in the description under this video. If you would simply rather read this in text format, for a lot of people it's faster to read things. I know I often feel that way. Feel free to just go over to that link and read it manually, but some people prefer video things, some people like the video podcast style. And this video is for you guys, or for people that just haven't seen this on my website. Anyway, there is going to be some video footage in the background, so you have something to look at. This is just some random person playing Diablo 3 on Twitch, and I just recorded them playing for about an hour, so you'll have an example of what gameplay looks like. This is a level 60, level 60 necromancer, or excuse me, witch doctor, still in Diablo 2 mindset, and they're basically just grinding a character. Trying to grind Paragon levels or something like that. But anyway, that'll just be in the background so you have something to look at while I'm playing and give you an example of what high-level Diablo 3 gameplay looks like, which I think is quite boring. Anyway, so the idea behind this, the purpose behind this, is to answer the question of what made Diablo 3 so unsatisfying? Why was this game such a disappointment to so many people, myself included? Because I was planning on doing a lot with Diablo 3, and it just was a very unsatisfying game. That's the best adjective I can come up with. So let's go through. I'm going to explain some of the conclusions I came to when I went back a year after the game came out and tried to do some sort of post-mortem analysis for basically what went wrong with this game. A number of you might have seen that I had a Diablo 3 shortcut sitting on my desktop for a long time. It actually sat there unused for over a year when I finally got rid of it. With the inspiration for putting this together was when the console release of Diablo 3 came out, which was in October of 2013. I was like, you know what, this is a good time to go back and finish up with Diablo 3 and put a close to this section of both my website and this for the YouTube channel. So for a game that launched with such immense fanfare and promise, it's kind of hard to believe how little long-term impact Diablo 3 actually had on the larger gaming community. While Diablo 2 remained extremely popular for many years after its release, Diablo 3 was almost completely forgotten by the end of 2012, which was just a few months after it came out. Diablo 3's rise was meteoric. They actually sold over 10 million copies in the first few months, but its fall was equally catastrophic. Diablo 3 actually had one of the fastest abandon rates of any online game ever. And I have some links on the website that actually go into more detail on this if you're curious. So with all the hype and excitement in the rearview mirror at this point, let's take a minute to examine what specifically went wrong with the design of Diablo 3. Let me establish one thing first at the outset. Diablo 3 is not a bad game, and it doesn't belong on the short list of worst sequels ever, as I've seen people bandying about in some corners of the internet. Diablo 3 didn't have any crippling bugs. The presentation values for this game were almost amazingly good. It's actually a crazily beautiful game. I've seen some people compare the environments to the work of a Renaissance painter. It's a very well-presented game. And if you only played through the game one time, you'd probably be happy with the experience. Indeed, many of the biggest problems with the gameplay only became apparent on multiple playthroughs, especially on higher difficulty levels, which helps to explain why so much of the initial reception of the game was positive. Me personally, I pride myself on not getting taken in when it comes to gaming reviews, and even I had very positive impressions from my first character run on normal difficulty in Diablo 3. For me, the word that best describes the Diablo 3 experience is unsatisfying. In other words, a feeling that the game was decent enough for a little while, but it failed to live up to its predecessors and ended up squandering the enormous potential that it could have had. So this article, this video, it's designed around understanding how and why so many fans walked away from Diablo 3 with that unsatisfied feeling. And I'm going to run through some of these points in list form. Let's start with the whole issue of no customizable stat points. Now, technically, stat points are still in the game in Diablo 3, but you don't get to assign them, and they might as well not really exist, given how they function passively in the background. We'll leave out stat point gains from items for the moment. We'll get to some of the problems with itemization in a little bit. This was something that was controversial prior to release. Blizzard's development team made it clear that they were removing the ability to assign stat points on level up. This was kind of a big deal because if you played the original Diablo, not Diablo 2, but the original Diablo, those stat points were the absolute core of the original Diablo's character system. And they were still an important part of the gameplay in Diablo 2, so this was a major shift. Blizzard argued that the stat point system was an outdated design element, something that was difficult for newcomers to understand, and that it represented a burden of knowledge penalty, one that only experts utilized correctly. In Diablo 2, you wanted exactly enough strength and dexterity to equip your chosen items, and then pretty much everything else generally went into vitality. There was an optimal stat point allocation for each build, and anyone who didn't know that setup was wasting many of their points. These arguments are quite correct, and I completely understand why Blizzard made the decision that they did. A lot of people put stats in basically the wrong categories in Diablo 2. Now, what that overlooked, however, was the fact that 99% of the people playing Diablo were not power gamers, and they didn't need or even care about an optimal allocation of stat points. In fact, screwing around and making mistakes with stat points was much of the fun of the games. I remember one guy who decided he would put every single point into strength and just see how far he could get with that setup. I mean, it was horribly suboptimal, but so what? It was fun. Dump everything into strengths. Just make a character based around that. The variant community at places like Realms Beyond made a living from having characters who never assigned any stat points at all. I mean, they'd be running around through hell difficulty with 300 unused stat points on their character sheet. That was actually a lot of fun for a lot of people to do that. Removing the customization of stat points, it just eliminated these kinds of choices from the game. Now again, that would have been fine if they had replaced them with something else interesting in terms of building characters. But the problem is, they didn't. It was simply a removal of customization and nothing else. This contributed to a sense of blandness in Diablo 3, where every barbarian felt exactly like every other barbarian. And that's something that wasn't helped by the new skill system either. So let's look then at the skill system in Diablo 3, which I've characterized as being both boring and homogeneous in nature. The design from Diablo 3 removed the skill trees that were used in Diablo 2, and indeed removed the whole new notion of skill points in general. Instead of picking skills and assigning points on level up, skills were instead unlocked automatically, in a set progression for each class, a progression that never varied or changed. Skills in Diablo 3 could then further be customized by runes, with 5 runes for each skill, granting the theoretical possibility for hundreds of different skills and an infinite variety of combinations to mix and match. On paper, this system sounded absolutely amazing, and it is, while the newness factor is in operation. But with the passage of more time, the gilt starts to come off of this system and begins to reveal the lead lying underneath. One of the biggest problems with this system is its sheer rigidity. Each of the 5 classes unlocks every skill and every rune in the same order on every playthrough, no matter what you do. So every single time you play a wizard or every time you play a barbarian, you're unlocking the same skills and the same runes in the exact order every time. And because there are no skill points to assign, each one of those skills will always function in the exact same fashion for every character of the same class. There's no option to dump all of your skill points into an unusual skill. You know, you can't put everything into Firebolt or something like that and play an underpowered character. Furthermore, because every skill scales off of weapon damage, there are no starter skills or weak skills anymore. And again, that's a laudable design goal. I understand why Blizzard tried to do things this way. They're trying to prevent people from making mistakes and putting 20 points into one of the early skills that nobody ever uses. But unfortunately, one of the net results of all this is that all the characters tend to play the same way. It doesn't really matter what skills you even choose to take. All the skills scale off of weapon damage, and they all do pretty much the same thing. Nor can you choose to play a deliberately weak variant character for extra fun and challenge. It's all the same, and it all gets bland very fast. There's no real reason to create more than one character of the same class in Diablo 3, because you can just change their skills around at any time. While this started from a positive design idea to remove the sense that players wasted skill points in early game skills, it also did a lot to kill replayability. Back in Diablo 2, I want to create new characters to test out a different skill path. You know, I want to create a new Sorcery to create a different skill tree path. But in Diablo 3, there's just no point. Every wizard is exactly the same. Why should I create a new one? I can just respec my character and, transform into something completely different. It's a good design goal, but it tends to make all the characters feel the same. And it's not just the case that every monk can instantly change their skills and turn into an exact copy of every other monk, although of course that's already a huge problem. The different classes simply did not play out very differently in my experience, due to the way in which they all were shoehorned into the same skill scale off of weapon damage and primary-secondary skill system. All the classes tended to feel pretty similar to me when I played Diablo 3. In Diablo 2, for example, there's a huge difference between a sorceress who's casting spells to deal damage and, say, an Amazon or a barbarian who's auto-attacking most of the time and then throwing in a spell occasionally for extra damage. In Diablo 3, on the other hand, due to the way in which a primary skill like magic missiles has been added to the game, there just isn't much difference between a wizard left-clicking to attack at range and a demon hunter who's doing the same thing. Nor does it even matter what weapon your characters are holding in Diablo 3. I mean, they could be holding anything, since all the damage is determined by that weapon's DPS rating. In the older Diablo games, it really mattered whether your character was using a sword, or a polearm, or a bow, or a staff, or whatever. In Diablo 3, the weapons are all interchangeable. They all function exactly the same way. They just scale off weapons damage. And so that does much to make all the classes much less unique as well. It also doesn't help either that many of the skills in Diablo 3 are heavily cooldown based, which again removes many of the tactical considerations from the gameplay. In Diablo 2, a sorceress or a necromancer can empty their whole mana ball in a few seconds if they need damage right now, and indeed that was a huge part of the fun in the game. Guzzle down those mana potions and set off a dazzling array of pyrotechnics. This just isn't possible for most of the skills in Diablo 3, since nearly every non-primary skill is on cooldowns that require the player to sit and wait before they can use them again. By the way, mana potions don't even exist in Diablo 3, so you can't just guzzle the blue potions and spam away. Oh, sure, I understand. This is all standard for most online games these days. Most online games do use a system of cooldowns, but it still does represent a major shift from the gameplay of a decade earlier. The best example to me was the sadly nerfed teleport skill, in which past games you could use them endlessly with no cooldowns, and you could do all sorts of insane waypoint runs through hordes of monsters where you're just teleporting willy-nilly through all kinds of enemies. The teleport skill in Diablo 3 can be used once, or 2 to 3 times with the right rune, and then it goes on cooldown for about a dozen seconds. It's just boring to use, and that's a common problem throughout Diablo 3's skill sets. Blizzard was so busy trying to balance everything for power gamers that they forgot to make the skills fun and interesting to use. A teleport that you can only cast one time, and then it goes on cooldown for 15 seconds, it's just not much fun. And that's a problem that characterizes the whole skill system. Diablo 3 also strictly limits players to primary, secondary, and then 4 other action bar skills, with an utter maximum of 6 that can be used at any time. And then there are, of course, 3 purely passive skills you can choose, but that limit of 6 active skills is a hard cap. This always seemed like kind of an odd choice to me. Why limit players to only 6 active skills when there's 30 different choices for each character class? With some skills having extremely long cooldowns, as long as 2 or 3 minutes in some cases, it always felt like there was plenty of room to let players pick 8, 10, a dozen skills if that's what they wanted. And I certainly did in past Diablo games, even if I mostly stuck to a handful of skills. In Diablo 2, I often had 8 or 10 skills bound to the different function keys, for example. So why the restriction? Why only 6 active skills for Diablo 3? Well, now we know the answer. Diablo 3's design was specifically limited so that Blizzard could do console ports later on. And I actually have screenshots from the console version of Diablo 3 on the website version of this. But anyway, if you see the screenshots, it's immediate how this works out. What a coincidence. The 6 skills limitation from the PC version turns out to match up perfectly with buttons on an Xbox controller. Wow, amazing how that just happened to fall together perfectly. Now, I'm not one of those people who looks down at consoles and sees console gaming as inferior. I love console gaming. I've been running games on consoles for almost 3 decades now, and I think there's a lot of advantages to consoles. They're just better at a lot of things. 2D platformers, local multiplayer, etc. However, I also believe PC games should be designed with PCs in mind, and console games should be designed with consoles in mind. Trying to shoehorn PC gameplay onto consoles, or vice versa, just results in gameplay that doesn't please anyone. And for a good example of this, see the Nintendo 64 version of StarCraft. It's a disaster. Anyway, Blizzard deliberately limited the skill system from Diablo 3 to make it easier to do console ports a year later down the road, even though they denied this at the time. And yes, that does disappoint me greatly. I have no issue with porting Diablo 3 on other platforms. I mean, they put the original Diablo on the PlayStation, for example, but they shouldn't have limited Diablo 3's design in order to do easier console ports down the road. So shame on them for that. They limited the skill system just to make console ports easier. And yes, that is a real problem, in my opinion. Alright, so a little bit also about some of the online problems with Diablo 3. D3 differed from its predecessors by requiring a persistent connection to the internet at all times. There's no such thing as a single-player game in Diablo 3. Even if you're playing by yourself, you're simply engaging in a multiplayer game with no one else present. Everything runs off of Blizzard's servers at all points in time. Although this might have been a minor irritant for some people, it was an unnecessary design step that led to real harassment and serious problems for others. I remember logging into the game shortly after Diablo 3's release, only to find that the Blizzard servers were down. I couldn't play the game. But wait a minute, I only want to use my single-player character. Why do I have to connect to the internet? Doesn't matter. Anyone who wants to access Diablo 3 has to go through Blizzard servers every single time. This also meant it was impossible to play the game without suffering through server lag, which, yes, could be quite bad at times. So nope, no hardcore characters for me. I had zero interest in losing a character permanently because of a faulty connection issue. And yes, believe me, that did happen to people. I can understand the requirement to log into a game like League of Legends or World of Warcraft because those are online PvP games and you have to interact with other players. Obviously, you have to go through Riot or Blizzard servers to be able to play something like those games, and sometimes they're down for maintenance or whatever. We understand that. But Diablo 3 is not a PvP game. It's designed as a PvE game, player versus enemies, and most people played the game solo. So these various online restrictions, they were a real pain in the ass, and not just in the immediate week of launch. You pay $60 for a game that you then can't play because of server lag or servers being down or what have you. And yes, I do rate that as a very real problem for a game that's primarily PvE and primarily single player. So was there any reason for Blizzard to implement these online restrictions? Well, they argued it was important for security concerns, but that always felt pretty dubious given the rampant problem of accounts getting hacked, which was legion in the first couple months of the game coming out. And that problem of accounts getting hacked was surely made worse by the fact that every single account had to log into Blizzard servers for every play session. Much like EA's assertion that their most recent SimCity game had to be online to function properly, the argument that Diablo 3 had to have a consistent internet connection for security purposes turned out to be a complete sham. The console versions of Diablo 3 will not require a same persistent online connection, and that showcases how unnecessary the whole idea was in the first place. If you can play Diablo 3 on PlayStation 3 without connecting to the internet, you certainly can play it on your PC without having to connect to the internet. Blizzard only insisted on an internet connection just because it benefited them as a company to do so, in order to cut down on the used game market and resales of their games. And furthermore, to ensure that they funneled as many people as possible into their online auction house. It certainly didn't do much of anything to stop people from pirating Diablo 3 if they wanted to do so. Like everything else, it's very easy to pirate this game if you want to do so. The whole online system had everything to do with maximizing revenue for Blizzard and Activision, and really did nothing to improve the player experience. While I can't speak for anyone else, this whole system turned me off from wanting to play Diablo 3, and it made me less inclined to continue on with the game. But hey, they got my purchase money for Diablo 3, I guess they don't care about anything else, right? Gaming publishers rarely think about anything beyond the next quarterly statement. They don't seem to care about degrading the quality of a brand name if they can make a quick buck in the short term. It's going to be interesting to see how a Diablo 4 is received if and when one is made. A lot of people got burned on Diablo 3. But enough about items. Enough about online. Let's look at one of the real problems with this game, and that being the issue of itemization. Itemization is probably the single biggest issue with Diablo 3 as a game. And I have some info. I actually have an infographic that someone else made on the website. I'm not going to read through that, but if you're interested, go ahead and look at the written version of this on my website. Anyway, there's a nice summary up here of some of the major problems with itemization. The most basic problem with Diablo 3's itemization is it's far too simplistic. Leaving aside perhaps very high-level Inferno play, there's only 3 stats that matter at all in this game. Health and Vitality, which are basically the same thing. Your primary stat, whatever that happens to be, it's different for each class. And then finally, weapon damage. Out of the 3 of these, the amount of damage on weapons is the single most important stat in the game. Everything, and I do mean everything, scales off of weapon damage. As I mentioned in the skills section above, the actual skills that your character happens to be using, they barely matter at all. The one thing that matters is the DPS rating on your weapon. This will determine whether your skills are being laughed off by the enemies, or if you're running roughshod over them without breaking a sweat. The actual weapon type itself, completely irrelevant. Oh, you'll see a different graphical effect being carried around on the screen. You know, you'll be carrying a bow or a sword or whatever, but that's pretty much it. All 5 classes use a primary skill of some kind for basic attacks, which also scale off weapon damage, like everything else. So, what does it matter? Why does it even matter what you're carrying? You could be walking around with an ice cream cone or a ballpoint pen in your hand for all that matters in Diablo 3. Just look at that weapon's DPS rating, ignore everything else. Doesn't matter. None of the other modifiers or stats matter. Just DPS on your weapon. I mentioned this back in my initial review of Diablo, and I pointed out that it was a serious problem even then. But the more time that you spend with Diablo 3, the more problematic this whole idea of weapon damage becomes. Every weapon is exactly the same for every character class, and it all becomes boring incredibly quickly. After you've dealt with the weapon damage issue, all of the other itemization can be summed up in 2 stats. Vitality, which is basically health, and your primary stat. Your vitality gets turned into health in Diablo 3, stack as much of it as you can. Primary stat, which is either strength or dexterity or intelligence, depending on the class, your primary stat gets turned into more damage, which just makes it another version of weapon damage. Stack as much of this as you can too. Every other stat in the game? Worthless. Just stack as much vitality, and whatever your class happens to have as primary stat, and you're pretty much good to go in virtually every situation. You don't even need to see the character graphic in a picture to know which class it is, because all the stats have gone into whatever vitality and whatever the primary stat happens to be. So for this witch doctor that you're seeing in the background, I jotted down this guy's stats at the beginning of the video. 278 strength, 277 dexterity, 3,258 intelligence, 1,631 vitality. Can see everything gets dumped into intelligence and vitality because this is a witch doctor. All the other stats, just ignore them. Doesn't matter. Weapons damage, primary stat, vitality. Ignore everything else. Well, this leads to incredibly boring itemization because every single piece of gear is just a variation on the same 2 numbers. Vitality and intelligence. Vitality and strength. Vitality and dexterity. Just the same 2 numbers. From my own experience playing the game with the wizard class, my wizard character had vitality and intelligence on absolutely everything, and all the stuff was boring as hell. It was completely interchangeable. There was nothing memorable or interesting about any of it. Nor did this change at any point in time from the beginning of normal up to the end of Inferno. Get that maximum weapons damage ratings first, then max your vitality and primary stat. There's no customization to speak of. You'll just be crafting gems that add the vitality and your primary stat. Plus, there's no runes or charms in the Diablo 2 sense to round out equipment. You can't use unique items because, well, they've all but been removed due to the game, due to the online auction house. So you get an endless, dreary sea of faceless items with nothing to distinguish them apart, in a long line of succession of slightly higher numbers. Is it any wonder that people got tired of this system so quickly? One of the other things that's a problem in Diablo 3 is the lack of useful items that drop in earlier portions of the game. This is another problem I discussed in my earlier articles on Diablo 3. The problem of having too much scaling. This game scales way too hard and way too fast. Any item that you find at the beginning of an act will be badly outdated by the start of the next act and hopelessly antiquated by the start of the act following after that. This is totally different from past Diablo games, where it was possible to find quality or unusual unique items or otherwise unorthodox gear in Nightmare or even Normal, and then make use of them for a full character run. I've got an example of something that I found in Normal difficulty with a melee Skeletor summoner. The unique Grim Wand, Ume's Lament, for anyone who's that familiar with Diablo 2, but something that had +2 to Necromancer skill levels, 20% faster cast rate. It had +2 to useful skills, had +2 to Decrepify and Terror on it. And that was something I found in Normal that this character could use right up to the end of Hell difficulty because it had +2 Necromancer skill levels and 20% faster cast. What I did was I used the socket quest. I put a fire resist gem in there, a jewel in there, 27% fire resist, and that was a darn good item. I could use that, as I said, for all 3 difficulty levels, even though that particular character didn't make it that far. So I had a memorable item that helped to define this character I was playing. In contrast to that, nothing like this would ever be possible in Diablo 3. Any weapon that I found in normal difficulty would have to be upgraded every few levels to keep pace with weapons damage, or else the character would quickly become useless. Things like faster cast, things like elemental resistances, they don't really seem to matter at all in Diablo 3. As we know, only vitality, weapons damage, and primary stat matter. Everything else is irrelevant. And there's no skill levels either, part of what makes the skill system so uninteresting. I mean, in short, I could never find anything like this from random drops in Diablo 3. My characters would instead be going through an endless slog of similar items. Nothing in normal or nightmare difficulty would ever be even faintly usable in Inferno difficulty in Diablo 3. Even if by some untold miracle a unique weapon were to drop, which itself is basically impossible because, hey, you can't have too many uniques clogging up the auction house. Even if I would get a unique item, it would just soon be outclassed by a better weapon with a higher DPS rating. All of the uniques with odd modifiers from Diablo 2, the ones that let your characters access the skills of other classes and such, the ones that let you turn into a werewolf even if you're not a druid, those things just don't exist in Diablo 3. Or they have such an impossibly rare chance of appearing that you're basically never going to see them. This is all made much worse by anyone intending to play their character in pure fashion. What I mean, using only the gear that you find yourself, instead of twinking and muling and outright purchasing their gear online. For pure characters, the situation is most sad. For the purposes of optimal play, a character needs to upgrade every piece of their gear roughly every 5 character levels. It's almost like the game design was intended to push people into purchasing items in some kind of online store. Funny how that happens. Again, characters also scale just as hard with levels as they do with items. I've used before the example how at level 1 point of vitality is equal to 10 health. But at level 60, 1 point of vitality is equal to 35 health. And again, that's per point, mind you. Because you'll be getting more vitality from gear as time passes, this means that characters scale exponentially over time in their power curve, to try and match the same exponential curve of the monsters. A nasty side effect of this is that it's almost impossible to play Diablo 3 with friends online, unless you are exactly the same character level and have the same general quality of gear. Trying to play co-op with someone as little as 5 levels ahead of them will see them either totally untouched in God mode fashion, while you struggle to keep up, or vice versa. Blizzard does a good job of disguising this with their random matchmaking algorithm. They always put people together from the same part of the power curve. But if you don't randomly queue up with people, if you try to play with friends, it's horribly obvious how bad the power curve system is. No one is having fun with this system, and it makes it really tough to play the game with friends. If you're 5 or 10 levels ahead, you're in God mode, you can't be touched, and the other person is totally useless and irrelevant. It's not fun to play a game that's set up this way because there's too much scaling between characters. And of course, enemies scale in the same fashion. Enemies increase in both health and damage as time passes at an almost ludicrous rate. I'll reuse this example that I used last year. Here is the health and damage of an Act 1 ghoul. Normal difficulty, 40 to 80 hit points, 43 damage. Nightmare, 340 to 680 hit points, 397 damage. Hell difficulty, 2800 to 5600 hit points, 3670 damage. Inferno difficulty, 13,000 to 26,000 hit points, 180,000 damage. It scales at a ludicrous rate. It's going up at a factor of 10 per difficulty. So the gameplay has been deliberately set up so that players must sit around and farm gear at the beginning of new acts until they have enough new goodies to deal with the massively scaled up opponents. Or they can simply buy what they need online if they get tired of farming for better gear. And you don't have to be a cynic to see that Diablo's gameplay is very obviously intended to push players in this direction. But wait, can't players who are really good at the game just get past obstacles with lesser gear? If only that were true. So this brings up the last and most important section of this video review. And that is the subject of fake difficulty. Diablo 3 is one of the most blatant examples of fake difficulty I've ever seen in a game. And it is an intentional product of the game's design. First of all, let's define what I mean by the term fake difficulty. This is from the TV Tropes webpage if you're curious. When you play a video game, you expect to be able to use your skills as a gamer to beat whatever challenges the game throws at you. If the challenge requires a lot of skill, the game is hard to win. If it doesn't require much skill, it should be an easy game. However, some games that should be relatively easy are actually quite hard. It could be due to shoddy programming, a game-breaking bug, poor implementation of gameplay elements or time constraints, or if the developer threw in something that makes the game harder, but which has nothing to do with the players or AI's skills. This is fake difficulty. So anyway, that is end quote from that section. Most of the time, fake difficulty refers to poor programming or amateurish game design. Things like terrible controls, a game that has some impossibly cryptic plot token needed to complete the game, and so on. You see this a lot with older games from the 8-bit era, for example. A game that just has terrible controls, or it's like impossible to figure out what to do next, etc. Those are examples of fake difficulty. Now, in the context of Diablo 3, though, we're referring to the last part of that sentence I mentioned above. In other words, the developers threw in something that makes the game harder, but which has nothing to do with the players or the AI's skills. This is a perfect description of high difficulty in Diablo 3, Inferno, and to a lesser extent, parts of Hell difficulty. Diablo 3 differs greatly from its predecessors in downplaying the action elements of the game in favor of emphasizing the gear elements of the game. In prior Diablo games, it was possible to complete all 3 difficulties with severely under-leveled and under-itemized characters, just through incredible player skill level and deep knowledge of game mechanics. This was pretty much the founding principle behind Realms Beyond as a website. The variant group of players that made up Realms Beyond Diablo found ways to beat the game with no gear. They played what were known as naked mages, or even cursed gear that lowered your stats. Yes, Diablo 1 had cursed gear that would lower your stat. People were able to beat the game using all cursed gears. They were known as Beyond Naked Mages. Mages that weren't just naked and had no gear, but actually wore items that lowered your stats. And of course, this easily carried over to Diablo 2, where people played crippled variant characters, poking around with all sorts of crazy stuff, but still managed to beat the game on all 3 difficulties and get up to Diablo and finish the game. So everyone expected the same kind of gameplay would carry over to Diablo 3 as well. Well, the whole variant community was in for a rude surprise. In Diablo 3, it is not possible to overcome weaker gear through sheer player ability. Diablo 3 is full of unavoidable damage at every turn, monster attacks that simply cannot be dodged and have to be tanked through. I noticed this myself while playing. No matter what I did, no matter how carefully I played, I would still take damage constantly. There would be projectile attacks that you would clearly dodge on screen and would still hit you, ways that enemies would pop up on the screen where you would just take damage and there was nothing you could do. You would take hits no matter how carefully you played. You simply had to be able to tank through the damage in order to make progress. This was of course made much worse due to the changed potion system in Diablo 3. In past Diablo games, your character had a belt full of potions, mapped to the number keys on the keyboard, and intelligent use of potions was an integral part of the gameplay. I have watched highly skilled Diablo and Diablo 2 players take severely underpowered characters through seemingly impossible situations by knowing exactly when to drink through a belt full of full rejuve potions. Careful resource management, careful timing of potion use, that was a crucial ability that separated the skilled from the unskilled. But none of this is possible in Diablo 3, which replaced a belt full of potions with a single potion slot, with the potion slot going on a 30-second cooldown after each use. This mechanic works decently in normal difficulty because a potion will give you a full health restore, which is basically equivalent to drinking a full rejuve in past games. But by Hell and Inferno difficulties, the potions don't even come close to restoring your health, and that 30-second cooldown, that never goes away. Potions are virtually useless altogether in Inferno. Just watch the gameplay that's on the screen right now. This guy who's playing Witch Doctor, he never drinks potions at all. The potions are pretty much useless. They don't do anything. All of the gameplay centered around the tense and exciting full belt fight from prior games, that ceased to exist. Which means that winning or losing battles comes down to your gear yet again. Oh, and by the way, this was another gameplay alteration that had everything to do with making console ports easier down the road. Check out a screenshot from the Xbox or PS3 versions of the game. Note how the potion slot is mapped to a controller button instead of a belt of potions mapped to the numbers on a keyboard. Blizzard, if you want to go make a console game, then just go make a console game. Don't screw with your PC game design because you're lazy and you want to make console ports easier. Anyway, past Diablo games simply did not work this way. Diablo 3 makes it impossible to dodge many kinds of damage, and it removes the ability to mitigate damage through skillful potion usage by nerfing how potions work. You can't even town portal out of bad situations because town portal scrolls have been removed from the game in favor of that innate channeling portal ability, which doesn't work in combat because you have to stand in place and channel for 4 or 5 seconds. So no, you can't even use town portal scrolls to get out of a bad situation. Once you reach a certain point in Hell or Inferno difficulty, all of that unavoidable damage will one-hit kill your character if you don't have the correct gear to continue progressing. This is known as a gear check, and it necessitates farming up an entirely new set of equipment to reach the point where your character can move forward again. Then, if you're willing to do that for Act 1 of Inferno, be prepared for another gear check at the start of Act 2 Inferno, and another round of entirely new items that you absolutely need to progress, but won't drop in any earlier locations of the game, and so on. Rinse and repeat for each new area until the game is over. Each of these steps will take untold hundreds of hours to complete if you plan on farming the items yourself, while being subject to the whims of what happens to drop from the game's random number generator. And the whole time, there's an auction house sitting there online that allows you to shortcut the entire process if you're willing to spend real-world money. Ah, there we go. Everything about Diablo 3's design has been meticulously set up to funnel players in this exact direction. It's actually quite brilliant in a diabolical way how Diablo 3's gameplay has been so carefully crafted to force people into spending money in the online auction house. Because of the game's incredibly hard scaling rate, players absolutely must upgrade their equipment early and often, and players are forced to do so over and over and over and over and over again as they progress throughout the game. The items that drop naturally throughout the game fall woefully short of what players need, at least once they start to reach Hell and Inferno difficulties. At this point, players are forced into a choice. They can spend untold hours farming the same areas in the hopes of getting the drops they need to progress, or they can venture onto the online auction house, where Blizzard gets a cut of every transaction. Players will be faced with the same choice with every new act that they reach as they continue on through the game. Playing Diablo 3 on Inferno is therefore a Sisyphean task. You're endlessly pushing that boulder up the hill in search of better gear, only to come crashing down again with each new area reached. How anyone could enjoy this sort of thing is honestly beyond me. Diablo 3's challenge is therefore the worst kind of fake difficulty. It's based entirely on whether or not players have managed to achieve a high enough level of gear. While player skill does play some factor, it's far, far lower than in any previous game in the series. Diablo 3 actually resembles a traditional turn-based RPG in many ways, where character levels and equipped items are the main factor in determining victory or defeat, rather than the ability to dodge skill shots, kite mobs, and play strategically, the way you would expect in, an online action game. Well, do you have the correct items for this level of enemy? Well, congratulations, you win. They'll just roll over and die. Don't have good enough gear to clear this area? Oh, I'm sorry. It doesn't matter how good you might happen to be in terms of player skill level. You get hit with unavoidable damage and die. If you've been watching the gameplay in the background while this video has been going on, you might have noticed what this person who is playing a witch doctor has been doing. No strategic use of skills, just runs into every single mob, casts Soul Harvest, then spams Zombie Charger. If his gear's high enough, all the mob dies before he does, because he has enough lifesteal, or whatever it's called in this game, to tank his way through the damage. In a few occasions, you might have noticed, he doesn't deal quite enough damage, doesn't have quite enough lifesteal, and then he instantly dies. There's no thought, there's no strategy, there's no tactics. It's just a pure gear check. Do you have high enough numbers to clear these mobs? Then yes, you run over all of them, and a whole bunch of numbers appear on the screen, and the enemies all die. But if your gear is not good enough, they just kill you instantly instead. Really exciting gameplay. Is this actually fun? Is there anything going on here? It just seems like the most mindlessly boring thing I've ever seen. And again, past Diablo games did not work this way. I don't know how more I can emphasize this. Past Diablo games were not like this. You could use strategy to overcome underpowered characters. Smart use of tactics, intelligent building of a character would allow you to play very underpowered character builds and still progress through the game. But that's just not possible in Diablo 3. As I said, it is the worst case of fake difficulty. Whether you win or lose is based on your gear. Not on how well you play, but what gear you happen to possess. That's why this game is characterized by fake difficulty. So anyway, this is the feeling that's gripped so many people playing Diablo 3, even if they weren't able to articulate exactly how or why they weren't enjoying the game. Diablo 3's design intentionally forces player into a boring and unsatisfying treadmill, one where it's essentially impossible for them to find useful or interesting gear, and where their personal skill level has little impact on the challenge level of the game. Blizzard has set this up to force people into the auction house, which, despite their claims, the auction house is as integral to the overall design as the blacksmith or the jeweler. I just laugh when people try to claim the auction house isn't a problem, or you can just ignore the auction house and not use it. No, I'm sorry, you can't simply ignore the auction house. It is a fundamental part of the game, and it's impossible to progress your character in Inferno without making use of it to at least some degree. I mean, unless you have an impossibly large amount of free time on your hand to farm drops, but let's be honest here. In the real world, you have to use that auction house. Blizzard also deliberately killed the drop rates of anything useful or unique for auction house purposes, which means, yes, it is affecting your games whether you like it or not. Literally every single design element of this game, the way every skill works off weapon damage, the massive enemy scaling, the constant need to upgrade equipment, the gear checks with each new act, it is all based around the auction house. When you see this game from the big picture perspective, the comparisons of Diablo 3 to a giant Blizzard sweat shop, they start to ring true. Fortunately, there is an easy way out of this dilemma. Stop playing Diablo 3. That's the conclusion I reached after about 6 weeks of play, and I was hardly the only one, as the mass exodus of the player base in the months after release testified to. For me, the breaking point was late hell difficulty for my wizard character. I had stubbornly refused to use the auction house. I had not been fortunate enough to find a good weapon drop in a long time. Finally, I broke down and purchased something better, using in-game gold, not real money, but finally purchased something better. My DPS rating more than doubled instantly. I think it actually tripled, and the monsters that I had been struggling to fight before all went down like dominoes. That just killed any interest I had in the game, and I quit right then and there. But what was the point? I won or lost based on the item game, and I had zero interest in farming up gold to buy gear. The only way to win that game was not to play at all. So let's wrap this up and come to a conclusion here. At its heart, Diablo 3 ultimately failed to satisfy most players because it was designed with corporate shareholders in mind instead of actual gamers who'd be using the product. At every stage of the design process, Diablo 3 appears to have been created with the thought of, how can we generate the most revenue from this product? Instead of asking the question of, what would make this game fun to play? Customization of characters was strictly limited, without stat points and severe limits on skill choice. Itemization was made incredibly bland and uninteresting. A scaling system was put in place to require constant upgrading of gear, and the gameplay was reworked such that gear checks were infinitely more important than player skill ability. It was all designed to shepherd the player base into the auction house, force them to spend their money there if they wanted to continue to progress through the game. For all of its incredible beauty and years upon years of development time, Diablo 3 at its heart turned out to be a big budget version of one of those pay-to-win iPhone games. That's basically what Diablo 3 is. It is an incredibly beautiful, high-budget version of Candy Crush. That's what it is. It is designed to funnel you into the auction house and get you to spend money. But what Blizzard forgot somewhere in this huge process was the game simply wasn't fun to play. Not after the initial newness factor wore off. It's not fun to have cookie-cutter characters where the skills all feel the same. It's not fun to effectively remove unique items from the game because the parent company doesn't want them showing up in the auction house. It's not fun to force an endless series of gear checks on players and kill them instantly if they don't have the proper level of gear to move forward. And above all else, buying items from an online auction house, it's a lot less fun than finding them yourself from completing quests and killing bosses. It's truly amazing how a massive corporation could sink hundreds of millions of dollars into developing a game like Diablo 3 and not realize such incredibly basic facts. They made a dungeon-crawling, treasure-hunting game in which crawling through dungeons was boring, and you were supposed to purchase most of your treasure in an online store. I mean, it's nothing short of incredible that no one threw themselves in front of this at some point in the design phase. Diablo 3 ultimately failed to satisfy because it failed to understand basic human nature. I've thrown in here some references to the indie game Rogue Legacy above because I think the contrast between Rogue Legacy and Diablo 3 is interesting. Both of them are dungeon crawlers with randomly generated levels, with the focus on collecting various items that drop from monsters. And Rogue Legacy even has its own versions of Nightmare and Hell difficulties with New Game Plus, New Game Plus 2, and so on. Rogue Legacy operates on a much smaller scale, obviously, but I do think the comparison has merit. Despite working with the design team of only about 6 people and less than 1% of the budget of Diablo 3, Rogue Legacy's been a much more enjoyable gaming experience for me personally. And I would argue that comes down to 2 things: character customization and skill factor. Each time that your character dies in Rogue Legacy, you go back to the starting castle and you can spend the gold that you earn there on a variety of different upgrades. You can choose to pump physical damage, magic damage, health, armor, and so on. There are then more choices based on what gear and runes you choose to take with you. I mean, yes, it's all much smaller in scale than a game like Diablo 3, of course, but there's enough for real choices there. There's a lot of room to experiment with different variant paths. You can choose to upgrade your character in different ways. Or you can choose to upgrade nothing at all if you're a masochist. Within the dungeon, you're playing a 2D side-scroller similar to Castlevania or Metroid, and how far you go is mostly determined by player skill. Levels and gear do matter in Rogue Legacy. I mean, they matter a lot, but there's already YouTube videos of players beating the game at level 0. If you're really good, if you're a godlike platformer, yes, you can beat the game without any upgrades whatsoever. So Rogue Legacy is therefore satisfying for all the reasons Diablo 3 is not. There's real choices to be made in terms of customizing your character. Player skill determines success or failure, not gear checks. Rogue Legacy is a very hard game, but you'll win or lose based on your own ability. There's no omnipresent auction house looming over the gameplay, and there's no forced online logins. The game was made by a tiny development house that seemed to have had genuine joy and passion in crafting their games. In other words, it's the polar opposite of the massive corporation that Blizzard has become, where every decision is now beholden to Activision's demands for franchise exploitation and new streams of revenue. Rogue Legacy was made because the designers thought it would be awesome and fun to play. Diablo 3 was made because Activision Blizzard wanted to exploit players through a series of lucrative online financial transactions. Maybe the proper question isn't asking why Diablo 3 was unsatisfying. Perhaps we should be asking why Diablo 3 was able to retain even the small fraction of active players that it did. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Until next time, have a great week. See you guys again sooner. Take care.